Now, Alzheimer's and dementia don't impact all populations equally. Black and Hispanic Americans and women are more likely to develop forms of dementia. We've been discussing that several times today already. On top of that, people of color often face barriers to healthcare access and healthcare trust as well. I'm now joined by a panel of experts, great experts, to discuss how patients can receive equitable Alzheimer's care. Petra Niles is a gerontologist and senior manager of African American Services at Alzheimer's Los Angeles. Catherine Schubert is president and CEO of the Society for Women's Health Research, and George Vradenburg, good friend, I mentioned him earlier today, is chair and co-founder of of Us Against Alzheimer's. Thank you so much for joining us. Petra, let me start with you. And we were discussing earlier the ongoing challenges of trust between different communities in the United States and the healthcare system, and this phenomena, which I detest, that when you look at COVID, when you look at so many chronic diseases, that our communities of color in America carry a disproportionate burden in there. I really want this problem to go away. What do we do? And what's the Alzheimer's story?
Thank you, Steve, for that question, for having me here. What do we do? Partly, education is critical here, providing culturally relevant education to a community that's at highest risk for this. And what that looks like may have a variety of methods, and that should be considered. We also need to consider making sure that terms and words used around this disease are defined in a way that the targeted audience understands it the same way as those that are presenting the information. One of the first questions that I get in presenting information to our larger community is, what is dementia? What is Alzheimer's? So simply understanding what the disease is and the risk factors or warning signs, that's critical to even knowing about the disease.
Can you share with us an example of how you use cultural competition, or competence and language to bridge communities in Los Angeles?
Quite often I have to share information that includes the word caregivers, caregiving. And so my question to the audience is, how do you see that word? I simply ask them, how do you see that word? And the response has been, I see caregiver as someone I hire to come in the home, to assist the family, to provide care. And so they do not recognize themselves as the caregiver. I'm the husband, I'm the wife, I'm the daughter. And so if a medical professional is asking who is the caregiver, and the patient does not identify as the caregiver, then the messages or the benefits regarding caregiving is completely lost because of not identifying with the role.
I appreciate that, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Catherine Schubert, thank you for joining us as well. Look, Francis Collins the other day made the comment that because of this era of COVID we've been in, we probably had a $10 billion setback in the advancement of science and therapies and research across the board, in part from everything from clinical trial sites closing, from a huge drop-off in clinical trial participation across lots of classes of disease. I know that that's also been the case in Alzheimer's research. And so that creates another burden, even when I would say, as I know you know, that our clinical trial foundations were also not as representative as they should have been of our population. So I'd just love you to help us unpack it so we understand what we have to fix by getting representation in clinical trials, connecting the science, the drugs to people in the right way. But I want to say the last 2 years has sort of sucked.
Thank you for that question. I completely agree that this has been a challenge in a number of ways, and I think we're seeing it really play out now. I think the one thing that maybe COVID has brought to light is this issue. So knowing that We don't necessarily have trial populations that reflect what the treatment population looks like. And, Petra talked a lot about what those communities look like. And we know that people of color are underrepresented in clinical trials. We know that women largely are still underrepresented in clinical trials when they're really disproportionately impacted by Alzheimer's. And then when you add caregivers in there, that just exacerbates, I think, the challenges that we're seeing. In terms of infrastructure, I think it's probably time for us to be thinking about new ways to get to people where they are, new ways to not just think about how people are participating in trials or saying, oh, you should do this, but how do we make sure that people want to participate in those trials, right? So rather than just saying this is important and we need X population, we need their engagement. And you talked about this sort of centering the patient and centering the person through these experiences. They really do need to be built into the trial design. So your data may look a little bit different. It may be captured in different ways, but there's lots of ways to do that so that you're, again, meeting people where they are, looking at what the treatment population looks like and trying to mirror it as best you can, but really learning from the community about how you can reach them.
Now, Catherine, I've got you and Petra on. Do you two know each other already? No.
We do not.
Well, I want to introduce you to Petra. She's really cool. She's in LA. She's on the front line talking to community. So is Petra the kind of person you would reach out to or try to build in so that as she's developing trust and connectivity with communities that are going through this journey, that they can be brought in? I mean, it did this recently in Minneapolis with some of Amy Klobuchar's folks in the Somali community, and we had various trusted ambassadors in that. But I'm just wondering, are there playbooks to begin reaching out, using cultural competence, using trusted ambassadors like Petra to build them into trials? And is that high on the agenda for what you're trying to raise?
Yeah, we absolutely have
Catherine.
to. I mean, there's no way we're going to change things unless we do that. And in fact, it's funny you mentioned that, Petra. I was mentioning your name the other day because as we're looking at these issues, again, we can't come into communities and tell them how things are. The experts in that area are the people who live in these communities and the trusted resources. So really leveraging that and making sure that that's the way that the message is being captured is extremely important.
Oh, thank you. I hope we'll make sure you both are connected. But George Vradenburg, George, great to see you. Look, I think, and maybe this is a misframing, we've been friends for a long time, I just want to disclose that. I think when you and I first began discussing this topic, when I became aware of your obsession and constructive commitment to moving the needle on Alzheimer's, it was the last time a drug was approved. It was about 20 years ago we've been having these discussions. Now Aduhelm is out there, been approved. You've been focused on this. How tectonic a shift is this? What more do you expect around the corner with what the FDA approval on Aduhelm means?
Well, I'm going to back up just a little on the talk
Sure.
about the representativeness issue. This
Sure.
is a problem globally. 90% of the genomics work in Alzheimer's has been done in white Caucasian populations. 90% of the people are not white Caucasians. So that if you really want to get at this problem, I think you've heard earlier from Elias Suhuni about the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, which is a global effort to bring in the intelligence of the world, not just the intelligence in the United States and Europe, to this problem. And also clinical trials that will be highly diversified once you get into the populations of the world. We recently opened a clinical trial site in Rio Grande Valley, Texas. The population's 95% Latino. Boy, is the recruitment rate of minorities, in quotes, high at that clinical trial site. So to Katie's point, we have to go where the people are that have Alzheimer's. 25% of that population in Rio Grande Valley has Alzheimer's. So that's way above the national average. So this is a real problem that we need to get at structurally. ARPA-H, I think this is a program that Biden has proposed, I think is a terrific idea of how to get new platforms, new transformational technologies to lower the cost and increase the access of life-saving drugs and other interventions. So I think ARPA-H is a terrific possibility to really attack this problem completely anew in totally different ways on how to get lower cost treatments and how to get greater access well beyond the academic centers that are focused on this. Finally, you asked me about Aduhelm. I'm sorry, I got some feedback there, but you asked me about Aduhelm. I think the FDA, we have trusted the FDA for a long time to make the expert decisions on what drugs should be approved and what drugs should not be approved. They found this drug to be safe and effective, and as you noted, they've approved it. Now, everyone can have their own facts, everyone can have their own scientific facts, but we've assigned this responsibility to a specific agency by law, and they've made the determination. So in my view, that drug should be out there, available according to the label on that drug, and the confirmatory trial should be policed to make sure that it happens quickly and that it confirms the clinical benefit of the drug. CMS's decision really is going to set us way back. You remember Obama's goal was to find a means of prevention and effective treatment by 2025. The CMS decision is basically going to make that impossible. So they basically destroyed our ability to get to a means of treatment by 2025. Now, why do I say that? They basically say, even after you've been approved by the FDA, conducted the clinical trials needed to get that approval to prove your drug is safe and effective. Now Medicare is going to go through another round of clinical trials in order to themselves verify that it is safe and effective. Well, that process of doing another clinical trial is going to take up to 10 years. So basically, we have deferred now the ability of people with early AD to get access to any drugs, or at least the first class of drugs, for 10 years. That is unconscionable. Now, the population that is experiencing this disease is, as you mentioned, is skewed against minorities. So denying the population access to these new drugs, and it's not just Aduhelm, it's from Lilly, from Roche, from Eisai, 4 drugs will be denied to the American population, which is skewed against minorities and women. It's going to be denied for at least 10 years. That's right. Unconscionable.
Petra, I would love to get your reaction to what George Vradenburg just shared, because you're dealing with a community where you're trying to, improve access, improve trust, improve services, and there's been a decision that only those within trials, and of course we know the disproportionate representation of certain groups in trials and the lack of representation of other communities. Although here George is trying to work on that. But what's your view of this CMS decision?
I appreciate George's comments, and I do defer to him for those. I would like to share that how do we get treatment to those who need it? We can begin with already established community health centers in communities where the majority of those at risk reside, and to be able to support those in policies, funding, in a way that they are able to educate the community, those who come in to the centers, that they're able to provide screening and to be able to, again, provide resources. We do know that there can be a reduction of risk factors. And so specific to those risk factors, looking at foods and lifestyle changes that can be had and made to reduce your risk for this disease. So it's very important to consider those. I think reducing the risk is so much better than relying on the medication to come to solve an issue.
Thank you, Katie.
For the question.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. Just want to ask you, as you think about broadly the world of women's health research, in other areas that may be seemingly unrelated, are there any patterns or structures or best practices or I've traveled with Joe Biden before, where he was launching the cancer moonshot, and he got SAP and Google and other companies there that weren't necessarily in cancer research, but said, hey, we may de-silo some of these. Are there any insights that we should put on the table with our audience today from your experience in other disease fronts?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think first of all, when we think about women's health specifically, right, we have to think about, again, both the patient and the caregiver, knowing that 2/3 of caregivers are women, and particularly in the Alzheimer's space, that's extremely important. And again, to Petra's point, they're mostly unpaid. And so what does that mean? We're seeing, loss of economic dollars, a large burden, et cetera. And I think that translates to many areas of health generally, right? Women are known as the chief medical officers of their families. They're making healthcare decisions for maybe aging parents. They're also making decisions for children. And so I think there are a lot of challenges here. And I'm glad that you brought up the moonshot. I sort of have this broad vision. I'll put it out here with everybody here to really see some dedicated prioritization and dollars toward women's health broadly and across the lifespan. So not necessarily disease specific, although that's really important. We have to continue that work. On top of that, how do these different life stages interact with one another so that your healthcare impact can be better throughout your life? And so I think for me, that's something that's really important. And something that I think would go a long way just in terms of valuing health, again, across the board throughout the lifespan, and would make a big impact here as well.
George, finally, I'm going to give the last word to you. And I want to ask you a bifurcated question, two parts unrelated. Part one is I'm fascinated to hear about the trials that you've gone out to find where there's a high incidence of Alzheimer's in minority communities. So you're kind of fixing in part this challenge and problem. What more is on the horizon in terms of that? Are there things that other partners in this effort should be doing along those lines as well? That's part one. Part two is you're one of the most politically savvy people I know. Is there a way, what I asked this of Representative Tonko earlier, what is the pathway? Is it legislation? Is it changing the mind of Anthony Becerra, Secretary Becerra? Is it what do we need to do by way of changing the CMS decision if that is something you're trying to do?
Well, no question that if you put clinical trial sites in communities of color, you're going to get more communities of color who have reasonable access to clinical trials. It's fairly logical. But what the government has traditionally done is cited their trials in large academic centers, tertiary hospitals, which are largely, in white populated areas and high income areas. So that if you do clinical trials in the traditional government way through academic centers, you're basically not going to get minority populations because they don't live there, they don't trust those centers, they're not anywhere near where they live, and they don't speak the language or look alike the kinds of populations we need to attract. That's one of the additional problems of the CMS solution of doing additional clinical trials through academic centers, tertiary hospital centers. They're not going to solve the problem that way. There are other problems here because the comorbidities that tend to, if present, exclude someone from a clinical trial, hypertension, diabetes, those exclusionary factors are, those particular factors are of greater incidence in minority populations. So there is now an effort with our organization and with NIH and with others to really go through those exclusionary factors to identify the ones that are most barring minority populations from participation in clinical trials, even if they want to. Our clinical trial network, called the Global Alzheimer's Platform, has a national account with Lyft. So that if in fact people have transportation problems, the clinical trial site will basically make the reservation, make sure that the car shows up, make sure that to the appointment that you've made and takes you home. So that if in fact there are business practices, just plain old business practices that need to change in order to do this. On the government side, let me. You want to talk about the CMS decision, just quickly?
Yeah, I did. And I just want to say, and of course I meant Xavier Becerra, not as Anthony Becerra. Been a marathon, folks. So just a little correction.
You obviously have something in your ear.
No, this is all me. I know this ain't Anthony Becerra.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Very impressive then. Very impressive. Well, the CMS decision is a proposed decision, and they're going to come out with a final decision in 2 months. We hope they change their mind that they cover these drugs to label so that everyone can have access, so that we can actually, through a variety of techniques, understand how these drugs work in real world populations, not in a pristine, pure clinical trial population. We're only going to know whether these drugs work and what kind of significant impact they might have if we study their real impact in real world populations. That means cover the drug to label and put in place evidence development techniques that will in fact study what the impact is in real world populations, both safety and efficacy. Those that have participated in the Biogen trials, about half of them will say, as they've continued on that drug, half of them say they've been held steady now for 2 to 3 years in an earlier state of Alzheimer's, a much more functional state, and about half are not. But we don't really understand exactly why half of the population that gets these drugs is achieving some benefit and half do not. That is, when you average out the half that do and half that don't, you get what looks to the FDA or to some scientists as a marginal drug. Well, it's not marginal for half the population. It is marginal or worse, but for not, it may have no impact on half the population. We've got to study that, understand it in real world settings. So it will be a change at CMS. So CMS will have to review its decision with Xavier Becerra and then review it with the White House. And we'll hope that one of those levels of review will make the determination to give widespread access to these drugs, all 4 of them, Biogen, Lilly, Eisai, and Roche, and make sure that we understand how we can benefit the population with wide access.
Well, we'll certainly be watching that too. But George, I depend upon you to message me when you hear stuff before I do on that. We are taking.
I don't hear anything before you do, Steve.
We're going to take a question from the audience from Maureen Desmond. Maureen.
Hi, my name is Maureen Desmond, and I'm founder and president of Navigating Through Loss, where we help companies and their employees navigate through significant change and losses. My question for you today is, what are you finding as a means for support for the family caretakers of those diagnosed with Alzheimer's? Thank you.
Let's get responses from all of you. Petra?
Thank you for that question. One of the things at Alzheimer's Los Angeles, we provide care counseling for families and family members. We provide caregiver education as well as a variety of support groups for men and women, adult children, and so on. And we really take the role of the caregiver to heart. We understand the overwhelming task of one day, just being a mom and wife, and the next day, mom, wife, caregiver, and the role and the duties that come along with that. So we appreciate that question. Thank you.
Catherine, your thoughts?
We certainly need more of them. I think the work of organizations like Competence are critical here. The other thing I would add is there's probably need for more conversation about entering that caregiver stage and what resources might be available, right? A lot more education and awareness and tangible resources that you can use so that you can be better prepared as well. That's
great. And George, last word with you.
I think that I just echo the last 2 comments. This is basically done, geographically co-located and basically local organizations. Alzheimer's LA is terrific. Caring Kind in New York, but local Alzheimer's serving organizations are central to this particular role. And there's a new organization called Voices of Alzheimer's, which is a small startup organization working with Caring Kind, which provides emotional support. These are existing dementia dyads, that is both a caregiver and an individual with a disease, who provide emotional support almost the day after you get diagnosed with Alzheimer's and you begin to go through the process of the anticipatory grief of having a fatal disease. And they are emotional interventions, explaining what the process is going to be like, explaining what kind of resources will be needed. And so Jim and Jerry Taylor do that and started that organization called Voices of Alzheimer's, and it is terrific.
Let me just say as well to our questioner that I already know, because we're going to show a pre-tape and a tape I taped the conversation I had with Nanette Barragán, a U.S. House of Representatives member from California, who's a caregiver to her mother in this. And I think her answer to that question, which I get into, there's not nearly enough resources given to this. So, but it's a very powerful interview coming up next. But I really want to thank all of you. Wonderful conversation. Petra Niles, gerontologist and senior manager of African American Services at Alzheimer's Los Angeles. Catherine Schubert, president and CEO of Society for Women's Health Research. And George Vradenburg, chair and co-founder of Us Against Alzheimer's. Thank you all so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.